Planning and Writing a Narrative. Part 1. Structure and Story Elements. In this video, we are going to learn what a narrative is, the basic structure narratives follow, and the story elements that narratives have. What is a narrative? A narrative is a story. Its purpose is to entertain. Think about stories or narratives that you have read, seen in the movies, or seen on TV. What general structure do they follow? Narratives are all structured in a similar way. They begin with an introduction, often called an orientation. After the orientation is the problem, and then the solution. This chart shows how the excitement in a narrative builds as the story progresses. Let's look at each of these in a bit more detail, starting with the orientation. The orientation serves a very important purpose in a narrative. It introduces the reader to the characters in the story and the setting. The setting is the where and the when of the story. Perhaps the story is about some friends exploring a futuristic city, or maybe the story is a tale of an adventurer who is exploring the high seas on a sailing boat. After the orientation comes the problem, which is sometimes referred to as the complication. The problem is the most exciting part of the narrative. It's where something goes wrong for our main characters. Perhaps someone gets lost in the city with no way to get home. Or maybe the adventurer's sailing boat hits a reef and begins to sink. After the problem comes the solution. This is where the writer solves the problem. What quick thinking will help our character who is lost find their way back to their family? Or what will our adventurer do to escape his life and death situation? We usually separate the orientation, the problem, and the solution into their own paragraphs as a way to organize our writing. And if the narrative is quite long, the writer will use more paragraphs. This is the basic structure of a narrative. In the next video, we'll be looking at the language elements authors use to write narratives. EasyTeaching.net. Planning and Writing a Narrative. Part 2. Language Elements. In this video, we are going to learn what language elements authors use to write narratives. Before we start, let's revisit the purpose of a narrative. The purpose of a narrative is to entertain the reader. So, as the writer, we always need to be thinking to ourselves, how can I make my writing entertaining? One way that a writer can do this is by using a combination of adjectives and nouns to form noun groups. For example, the scared people, a towering skyscraper, the colourful fish, sharp coral. Noun groups allow the writer to be more descriptive, and they help the story come to life in the reader's mind. Two more language elements that good writers use are interesting verbs and adverbs. Take, for example, the sentence, "The scared children went through the door." The verb went isn't very descriptive. Instead, how about ran, hurried, or tiptoed? These verbs give the reader more information and they entertain. Here's another example. "Watch out," Evie said. What do you notice about the verb said? It doesn't give much detail, does it? What are some more descriptive verbs that could have been used? Shouted, whispered, laughed. Each of these adds a lot more detail to the sentence. We can also consider modifying the meaning of verbs by adding an adverb. How did she laugh? Playfully, cheekily, quietly, rudely. Using descriptive verbs and adverbs is important because they allow the writer to tell a better, more entertaining story. Writers can also use direct speech, which is when characters talk to one another. Direct speech can be used to show the personality of our characters, as well as give clues as to how they're feeling. Good writers also use text connectives to make their writing flow. One type of text connectives are pronouns. Here's an example of writing without pronouns. Read it to yourself. What do you notice? Did you notice that it's very repetitive and that it doesn't flow very well? By using pronouns, we can make this passage of writing flow better. Try reading it again now that pronouns have been added. Another device writers use to make their writing more connected is time connectives. Time connectives signal to the reader when an event took place. Take this passage of text as an example. Huddled together under a tiny blanket, the children fell asleep. They woke up to the deafening sound of a car horn. It sounds a little disjointed and is hard to follow. When did they wake up? It sounds like some time probably passed. So we can use a time connective to clarify how much time passed. Did they wake up soon after? Or the next morning? Or hours later? Time connectives help to orient the reader and pass time in our writing. Time connectives can make days, weeks, even years go by with the stroke of a pen. Good writers use noun groups, descriptive verbs and adverbs, and direct speech to make their writing descriptive and to entertain. They use pronouns and time connectives to make their writing cohesive and flow. In the next video, we will be looking at how to plan and write the orientation of a narrative. EasyTeaching.net. Planning and Writing a Narrative, Part 3, Writing the Orientation. We know that the basic structure of a narrative looks like this: orientation, problem, solution. In this video, we are going to focus on the orientation. The orientation is really important because this is where we get to share with the reader the where, the when, and the who. A good writer will always plan out their narrative first. Now, there are many ways to do this, but I'm going to make notes on this planning sheet. I'm going to write a story about two friends who build a treehouse. Now, although this video is focusing on planning and writing the orientation, it is important to have some ideas as to the problem and solution. I think an exciting problem for this story could be a big storm coming through, trapping the friends in their treehouse. I've thought of a few options for the solution. They could bunker down in their treehouse and wait for the storm to pass, or they could manage to climb down the tree and make it safely back in the house. I'll write them both down so I don't forget them when I'm up to writing the solution. Now back to the orientation. I've got a basic idea, but I should add some detail that I can use when I start writing. I need to think about how I'll introduce the characters and the setting to the reader. The setting will be in a park behind one of the friends' houses, perhaps in the late afternoon so it can get dark later in the story. The characters are two friends. I'll call them Jenny and Scott. The story will start with them collecting the tools and materials they need to finish their treehouse. Before I start writing, I'm going to add some phrases that I might like to use in my writing that will help me to be more descriptive. I don't need to use them all, but it is handy to have them written down. Notice that I haven't used complete sentences in my planning. I'm just getting down my ideas using words and phrases that I'll be able to refer back to later. Now I've planned out my orientation, I'm ready to start writing. I'm going to keep the planning sheet next to me as I write because it's important that I use it to help me. Okay, I've finished writing the orientation. Pause the video here if you'd like to read it. Otherwise, let's go through it together. Let's see where I have introduced the setting. The reader can tell that the story is set in the backyard. There is a tall oak tree, and in the tree is a treehouse. I also let the reader know that the treehouse is high up in the air. I think this makes it more exciting, and it could come in handy later in the story. I've also shown the reader that the story is taking place in the evening. Here I have introduced the characters. These are just their names, but I have also given the reader a few more details about the two characters. I use direct speech to show that Jenny is competitive, and that Scott is perhaps a bit anxious to get the treehouse finished. I used descriptive verbs like spilled and gazed to help build a vivid image in the reader's mind about the action that was happening. I used the noun groups evening sky and tall oak tree to help the reader really see the setting. Can you see some pronouns I used to help make my writing cohesive? Here are just a few. And here is a time connective. I also used direct speech to give the characters a little personality, but I was also careful not to use too much. I have tried to entertain the reader and I'm off to a good start, but I don't think my orientation is quite finished. I might add a few more interesting and exciting events that help the reader get to know my characters. And remember, just because this is the orientation doesn't mean that we shouldn't include some interesting and exciting events. In the next video, we will be looking at how to plan and write the problem of a narrative. EasyTeaching.net